The dust had barely settled on the grave of Katherine Taylor's husband when the roof of her cabin began to leak, sending water cascading through the rough-hewn beams that had once seemed as sturdy as her marriage. She stood in the middle of her cabin floor, an empty bucket in her hands, watching helplessly as rainwater dripped onto the bed she now slept in alone. Catherine Katie, to those who had known her before grief had hollowed her out, had never imagined at 26 years of age she would be facing the harsh Colorado wilderness as a widow. The year was 1876, and the small mining settlement of Pine Creek was hardly more than a collection of scattered buildings, a general store, and a saloon that served as the heartbeat of the community. 3 months had passed since influenza had taken Thomas, leaving Katie with a struggling homestead, dwindling supplies, and a cabin that seemed determined to collapse around her. As the rain continued to pound against the roof, Katie placed the bucket beneath the worst of the leaks and wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The cabin Thomas had built with such pride was betraying her, board by board. The winter had been brutal, and spring brought no relief, only relentless rain that found every weakness in the structure. "I won't lose this too," she whispered, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. This cabin represented everything she had left of her husband, every dream they'd shared when they'd ventured west from Boston 2 years earlier. She'd sooner collapse herself than watch it fall. Dawn brought temporary reprieve from the rain, and Katie wasted no time climbing onto the roof with a handful of shingles Thomas had cut before his death. The wood was warped from improper storage, but it was all she had. She hammered with more determination than skill, her knuckles bleeding as she struggled to secure the shingles in place. From her perch, she could see the entirety of their small homestead. The vegetable garden fighting to survive, the empty corral where they'd planned to keep horses, and the edge of Pine Creek's only road where a lone rider was approaching. Katie paused, hammer suspended in mid-air. Visitors were rare, especially those who ventured all the way to the outlying homesteads. As the rider drew closer, she could make out the broad shoulders of a man, the brim of his hat pulled low against the morning sun. He rode easily, confidently, a man accustomed to long journeys. She scrambled down from the roof, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance, her dark hair escaping its pins, her dress stained with dirt and pine tar. Standing in front of her cabin, she watched as the stranger dismounted, leading a sturdy buckskin horse laden with supplies. "Morning, madam," he called, his voice deep and resonant in the quiet clearing. "Isaac Daniels. I've taken work with Mr. Peterson at the lumber mill." He removed his hat, revealing hair the color of sun-bleached wheat and eyes that reminded her of the sky after a storm had cleared. "Katherine Taylor," she replied, resisting the urge to smooth her hair or brush the dirt from her skirts. "My husband is," she stopped, the familiar words catching in her throat. "I mean, this is my homestead." Isaac Daniels nodded, his expression revealing nothing of what he might think about a woman alone on the edge of wilderness. "Mr. Peterson mentioned there was a widow out this way, said you might be needing some assistance with repairs before the summer storms hit." Katherine bristled at the word widow, at the assumption of her helplessness. "Mr. Peterson is mistaken. I'm managing perfectly well on my own." As if to contradict her words, a section of the gutter she'd attempted to repair the previous week chose that moment to detach itself from the roof, clattering to the ground between them. Katie closed her eyes briefly, mortification heating her cheeks. When she opened them again, Isaac Daniels was surveying the cabin with a practiced eye, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. "Seems like the structure needs some reinforcement along the north wall," he said, pointing to where the logs had begun to bow. "And that roof won't hold through another heavy rain." "I'm well aware of the cabin's shortcomings, Mr. Daniels," Katie said, lifting her chin. "But as I said, I can manage on my own." Isaac studied her for a long moment, taking in her bloodied hands and the dark circles beneath her eyes. "With respect, Mrs. Taylor, there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered freely." "And what would you want in return for this freely offered help?" Katie asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. She'd learned quickly that in this part of the country, nothing came without a price. A flash of something hurt perhaps crossed his features before his expression settled back into careful neutrality. Nothing but perhaps a cup of coffee now and then. Mr. Peterson's paying me well enough for my work at the mill. Katie hesitated, torn between pride and practicality. The cabin would not survive another season without substantial repairs. Repairs she lacked both the strength and knowledge to complete alone. And there was something in Isaac Daniels' steady gaze that didn't trigger the wariness she'd felt around other men who'd come calling after Thomas's death. "I can offer you a cup of coffee now," she said finally, "and we can discuss what needs to be done." Isaac smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. "That would be just fine, Mrs. Taylor." He tied his horse to the hitching post. Thomas had installed one of the few things on the homestead that remained sturdy and followed her into the cabin. Katie was acutely aware of how small the space felt with Isaac's tall frame filling it, how the sparse furnishings highlighted her poverty rather than her resourcefulness. "It's not much," she said, moving to the stove to stoke the embers beneath the coffee pot. "But it's home." Isaac removed his hat, running a hand through hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "It's a good cabin, Mrs. Taylor. Solid foundation, strong bones, just needs some care." The way he spoke of the cabin with respect for its potential, rather than pity for its current state, loosened something in Katie's chest. She poured coffee into the only two unbroken cups she possessed and handed one to him. "My husband built it himself," she said, the words emerging easier than she expected. "He had such plans for this place." Isaac accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. "He chose good land, plenty of timber, access to water, a man with vision." "Yes," Katie agreed softly, "Thomas had vision. What he lacked was time." They sat in silence for a moment, the mention of her husband's name hanging between them like a physical presence. Isaac sipped his coffee, his eyes taking in the interior of the cabin, the carefully mended curtains, the small shelf of books, the quilt draped over the single bed. "I could start with the roof," he said finally. "It'll need to be completely replaced before winter, but for now I can reinforce the worst sections, stop the leaking." Katie studied him over the rim of her cup. He was older than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his early 30s. His hands were calloused and strong, his forearms roped with muscle beneath his rolled-up sleeves. A working man, not one of the dandies who occasionally passed through Pine Creek looking to make a quick fortune. "Why would you help me, Mr. Daniels?" she asked directly. "You're a stranger in these parts." Isaac set his cup down carefully. "I was raised to believe that a community looks after its own, Mrs. Taylor, even the newcomers." "Pine Creek barely qualifies as a community," Katie said with a hint of bitterness. After Thomas died, only the preacher's wife had come calling, and that was more out of Christian duty than genuine concern. "Then perhaps it should," Isaac replied. "I've seen what happens to folks who try to survive these territories alone. It rarely ends well." There was a story there, Katie sensed, but Isaac's expression discouraged questions. Instead, she found herself nodding. "Very well, Mr. Daniels, I accept your offer of help with the roof, but I insist on working alongside you and learning what you're doing. I won't be helpless." Isaac's mouth curved into a slight smile. "I never thought you were, Mrs. Taylor." Over the next week, Isaac arrived at the cabin each morning after his shift at the lumber mill. He'd work until dusk, teaching Katie how to properly seal joints, replace rotted wood, and secure the roof against the elements. His patience seemed endless, never showing frustration when she asked questions or insisted on trying tasks herself. "You've got a natural aptitude for this," he commented one evening as they sat on the porch steps, sharing a simple meal of beans and cornbread. "Most folks wouldn't have the patience for detail work." Katie glanced at him, surprised by the compliment. "My father was a clockmaker in Boston. I used to watch him work for hours, all those tiny gears and springs. I suppose I learned something about precision." "Boston?" Isaac raised an eyebrow. "That's a long way from Colorado territory." Katie nodded, her gaze drifting to the mountains that loomed purple in the distance. Thomas had tuberculosis. The doctors said the mountain air might help, and he'd always dreamed of having land of his own somewhere with open sky. Did it help, the mountain air? A sad smile touched Katie's lips. For a while, he was stronger here, happier. But then winter came, and with it the influenza. His lungs couldn't fight it. Isaac was quiet for a moment, and you stayed. It wasn't a question, but Katie answered anyway. This is all I have left of him, of us, our dream. She gestured to the homestead around them. I know it must seem foolish to you. Not foolish, Isaac said, his voice gentler than she'd heard it before. Brave. Katie felt heat rise to her cheeks and quickly changed the subject. What brings you to Pine Creek, Mr. Daniels? It's hardly a destination for most. Isaac took his time answering, his eyes fixed on the darkening tree line. I've been moving from place to place for some years now, worked ranches in Texas, mines in Nevada, lumber camps up north. Pine Creek seemed as good a place as any to stop for a while. A drifter, Katie said, unable to keep a note of disappointment from her voice. Isaac turned to look at her directly. I prefer to think of it as a man taking the measure of the country before deciding where to put down roots. There was something in his steady gaze that made Katie believe him, though experience had taught her to be wary of a man's promises. Still, as the days passed, Isaac proved himself different from the other men she'd encountered since Thomas's death. He never presumed, never entered her cabin without invitation, and most importantly, never treated her as though widowhood had rendered her incapable or desperate. By the third week, the roof no longer leaked, the north wall had been reinforced, and Isaac had repaired the chimney that had been threatening to collapse. The cabin stood stronger than it had even when Thomas was alive, a fact that brought Katie both gratitude and a complicated sense of guilt. I've been thinking about your corral, Isaac said one morning as they shared coffee on the porch. It had become their ritual coffee at dawn before he left for the mill, and again in the evening before he rode back to the small room he rented in town. No homestead's complete without a horse or two. Katie sighed, cradling her cup between her palms. Thomas and I had saved for a mare. After he died, I used the money for his burial instead. Isaac nodded, understanding without need for further explanation. Peterson mentioned he might have worked for you at the mill office. Bookkeeping correspondence, said a woman with education would be an asset. Katie's eyes widened. He said that, to you. I might have suggested it, Isaac admitted. Mentioned you were from Boston, educated, that you had a good head for figures. You had no right, Katie said, though there was more confusion than anger in her voice. I haven't asked for charity. It's not charity to recognize skill and put it to use, Isaac replied evenly. The mill's expanding. Peterson needs someone who can read and write better than most of the men around here. It's honest work, Mrs. Taylor. Katie fell silent, considering. The money from Thomas's small mining claim had nearly run out. She'd been selling her embroidery work to the general store for pennies, knowing it wouldn't sustain her through another winter. I'll think about it, she said finally. Isaac nodded, satisfied. That's all I ask. That evening, Isaac didn't arrive at his usual time. Katie found herself pacing the cabin, peering out the window more often than she cared to admit. When dusk fell with no sign of him, she told herself it was foolish to worry. He was a grown man, not beholden to her in any way. Perhaps he'd found more interesting company in town, or had simply grown tired of charity work for a stubborn widow. She was about to bank the fire for the night when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by irritation at her own reaction. She had survived months alone. She had no business becoming dependent on Isaac Daniels' company. When she opened the door, however, her irritation dissolved. Isaac stood in the yard, holding the reins of not one but two horses, his buckskin, and a sturdy brown mare with a white blaze down her nose. What's this? Katie asked, stepping into the yard. Isaac led the horses forward. Her name's Penny. Peterson was willing to advance part of your wages should you accept the position at the mill. I negotiated on your behalf. Katie approached the mare cautiously, running a hand down her sleek neck. The horse nickered softly, nudging at her palm. You bought me a horse. You bought yourself a horse, Isaac corrected. With the work you'll do for Peterson, I just facilitated the transaction. Katie wanted to be angry at his presumption, but the reality of what stood before her overrode her pride. A horse meant mobility, independence. It meant she could travel to town without relying on the occasional passing wagon. It meant her homestead had a future. "She's beautiful," Katie whispered, pressing her face against the mare's warm neck. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Isaac." It was the first time she had used his given name, and something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of a connection that had been growing steadily since his arrival. "You're welcome, Katherine," he replied softly. The next morning, Katie rode Penny into town alongside Isaac, her heart lighter than it had been in months. Mr. Peterson, a gruff but fair-minded businessman, hired her on the spot after reviewing her neat handwriting and quick calculations. The position would require her presence in town 3 days a week, with the remainder of the work to be completed at her cabin. "Daniels speaks highly of you, Mrs. Taylor," Peterson said, eyeing her appraisingly. "Says you've got more sense than most men in these parts." "Mr. Daniels is generous in his assessment," Katie replied, though she stood a little straighter at the compliment. "He's not a man who's free with praise," Peterson said. "I've known him for some years now, off and on. If he vouches for someone, that's good enough for me." Katie glanced at Isaac in surprise. "You've known Mr. Peterson before coming to Pine Creek," a flicker of something passed over Isaac's face. "Our paths have crossed in various lumber operations," he said smoothly. "It's a small industry in some ways." Peterson looked between them, a knowing glint in his eye. "Daniels here is being modest. He's designed half the sawmills between here and Oregon Territory. Man's got a gift for engineering." Katie turned to Isaac, who was now studying the floor with unusual interest. "Engineering. I thought you were a mill worker." "I work at the mill," Isaac confirmed. "The specifics weren't relevant to fixing your roof." There was clearly more to the story, but Katie sensed now wasn't the time to press. Instead, she completed the necessary paperwork for her new position and arranged to begin the following week. As they rode back to her homestead, Katie couldn't help but observe Isaac with new eyes. His hands, which she had assumed were calloused from manual labor alone, now revealed themselves as the hands of a craftsman, precise and deliberate in their movements. His quiet competence took on new meaning. "Why didn't you tell me you were an engineer?" she asked as they crossed the small creek that marked the boundary of her property. Isaac adjusted his hat, squinting against the afternoon sun. "Would it have made a difference? When I offered to help," Katie considered this, "perhaps I might have been less suspicious of your motives." A faint smile touched his lips. "And here I thought it was my charming personality that won you over." Despite herself, Katie laughed a sound so unexpected that it startled her. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed aloud. "I wouldn't go that far, Mr. Daniels." His smile deepened. "We're back to Mr. Daniels, are we? And here I thought we'd made progress." There was a warmth in his teasing that wrapped around Katie like a blanket, comfortable and unfamiliar all at once. "Force of habit," she said softly. "Isaac." The way his name felt on her lips stirred something inside her, a feeling so long dormant she barely recognized it. Attraction, interest, the awareness of herself as a woman, not merely a widow. The realization frightened her, and she urged Penny ahead, putting distance between them as they approached the cabin. Isaac didn't press, allowing her the space she suddenly craved. As summer settled over Pine Creek, Katherine's life fell into a new rhythm. 3 days a week, she rode into town to work at the mill office, organizing the accounts and corresponding with suppliers. The other days, she tended to her garden, cared for Penny, and continued improvements on the cabin with Isaac's guidance. He remained a constant presence, though something had shifted since the revelation of his engineering background. He spoke more freely of his travels, of the various mills and buildings he'd designed across the Western Territories. Katherine began to understand that Isaac Daniels was not merely a drifter but a man whose skills were sought after, a man who could have commanded a much higher position than the one he held in Pine Creek. Why here? She asked one evening as they sat on her newly repaired porch, watching fireflies dance at the edge of the clearing. Why work as a common laborer when you could be designing mills in larger settlements? Isaac was quiet for so long that Katherine thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice held a weight she hadn't heard before. I was chief engineer for the Western Railroad Company in '73, he said. Designed a bridge over the Little Missouri. It collapsed during a flash flood. 7 men died. Katherine's breath caught. Isaac, I'm so sorry. He shook his head, his profile sharp against the darkening sky. The company cleared me of wrongdoing, said it was an act of God, the flood coming when it did, but I should have anticipated it, should have designed for it. You can't predict every possibility, Katherine said gently. No, but that's my job, was my job. He rubbed a hand across his jaw. After that, I couldn't bear to put my name on anything significant, started taking smaller jobs, moving around, keeping to myself. Understanding dawned on Katherine, until Pine Creek. Isaac turned to look at her then, his eyes reflecting the last light of day. Until your cabin. The simple statement hung between them, laden with meaning Katherine wasn't ready to examine too closely. Instead, she reached out hesitantly and placed her hand over his where it rested on the porch step. His fingers were warm and rough against hers, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Then, gently, Isaac turned his hand palm up, enfolding her smaller one within it. They sat in silence as darkness fell completely, holding hands like young lovers, though both carried too many scars to be young in any way but years. That night, after Isaac had ridden back to town, Katherine lay awake in her bed, her hands still tingling from his touch. Thomas had been dead for only 8 months. Was it disloyal to feel this stirring of attraction for another man? Or was it simply the natural progression of life, the heart healing as surely as a broken bone knits itself back together? She had loved Thomas deeply, completely. Their marriage had been a partnership built on mutual respect and shared dreams. But Thomas was gone, and Katherine was still here, still breathing, still capable of feeling. The realization both comforted and unsettled her. July brought scorching heat and the threat of wildfires. The forest surrounding Pine Creek turned tinder dry, and the town organized fire watches. Isaac, with his knowledge of terrain and building materials, was appointed to lead one of the watch groups, which meant his visits to Katherine's cabin became less frequent. She missed him more than she wanted to admit, even to herself. The cabin, which had once felt like a burden, a constant reminder of her losses, now seemed lonely without his presence. She found herself lingering in town after her work at the mill was complete, finding excuses to pass by the lumber yard where Isaac might be. It was during one such extended stay in town that Katherine became aware of the whispers. Mrs. Hollister, the preacher's wife, gave her a particularly cold look as she passed the church, and several men at the general store fell silent when she entered. "Don't mind them," said Martha Jenkins, the shopkeeper's wife, as she wrapped Katherine's purchases. "Folks around here have little enough to talk about. A widow and a handsome bachelor make for good gossip." Katherine felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Mr. Daniels has been helping with repairs to my cabin. There's nothing improper." Martha patted her hand. "No need to explain to me, dear. I've seen the way that man looks at you. Nothing improper about a man admiring a woman he respects." The words stayed with Katherine as she rode home, her purchases secured in Penny's saddlebags. "The way that man looks at you." Had she been so absorbed in her own confusing feelings that she'd missed signs of Isaac's interest? Or was Martha simply seeing what wasn't there? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sight of smoke rising from the chimney of her cabin. Katherine tensed, then relaxed as she recognized Isaac's buckskin grazing alongside the corral she'd built for Penny. Still, it was unusual for him to arrive at her cabin when she wasn't home. She found him inside, stoking the fire in the stove, a pot of stew simmering. The domestic scene struck her with unexpected force, the broad expanse of his shoulders as he bent over the stove, the easy way he moved through her space, as if he belonged there. "Isaac," she said, setting her packages on the table. He turned, a smile breaking across his face at the sight of her. Catherine, I was beginning to worry. It's getting late. I had errands in town, she explained, suddenly self-conscious under his gaze. I didn't expect to find you here. Peterson gave me the afternoon off, thought I'd come check that reinforcement we did on the east wall. He gestured toward the stove. And I brought supper. Seemed a fair exchange for all the meals you've provided. Catherine moved to the stove, lifting the lid on the pot. The rich aroma of beef and vegetables filled the cabin. You cook. Isaac's laugh was warm. I've lived alone a long time, Catherine. A man can only eat so much jerky before he learns to make a proper meal. She looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. People are talking, she blurted out, in town about us. Isaac's expression sobered. Does that bother you? I don't know, she admitted. Should it? He considered this, his blue eyes intent on her face. That depends on whether the talk holds any truth. Catherine's heart quickened. And does it? Instead of answering, Isaac raised his hand slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away. When she remained still, he gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. I think you know it does, he said softly. At least from my side. Catherine drew in a shaky breath. Isaac, whatever she might have said was interrupted by a frantic pounding on the cabin door. They jumped apart like guilty teenagers as Catherine moved to answer it. Billy Jenkins, Martha's 12-year-old son, stood on the porch, breathless and wide-eyed. Mrs. Taylor. There's a fire coming up from the South Valley. Pa sent me to warn all the outlying homesteads. Says everyone should get to town right away. Isaac appeared behind Catherine, his expression immediately shifting to one of focused concern. How far, Billy? How fast is it moving? Pa says it's already reached the Peterson place, Billy gasped. Wind's pushing it this way, the whole town's organizing to fight it, but go, Isaac said firmly. Warn the Hendersons up north. We'll head to town immediately. As Billy sprinted toward his horse, Isaac turned to Catherine. We need to move quickly. Gather whatever's irreplaceable. I'll hitch the wagon. Catherine stood frozen for a moment, her mind struggling to process the sudden shift from intimate conversation to imminent danger. Then training took over the hard-won lessons of frontier life that had taught her to react first and feel later. She moved through the cabin with purpose, collecting the few precious items she couldn't bear to lose. Thomas's pocket watch, her mother's Bible, the quilt her grandmother had made for her wedding. Everything else, she realized with stark clarity, was replaceable, even the cabin itself. Outside, Isaac had already hitched her small wagon to Penny and was filling barrels with water from the creek. We'll wet down the roof and walls before we go, he explained as she emerged with her bundle. It might not save the cabin if the fire comes this far, but it gives it a fighting chance. For the next hour, they worked in grim silence, soaking every exposed surface of the cabin. The smell of smoke grew stronger, and when Catherine climbed onto the wagon seat beside Isaac, she could see an ominous orange glow to the south where the Peterson ranch lay. Will we make it to town? She asked, clutching her bundle to her chest. Isaac's jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Yes, but we need to hurry. They set off at a brisk pace, Isaac driving the wagon while leading his buckskin alongside. Catherine twisted to look back at her cabin, standing solitary and vulnerable against the darkening sky. For the second time that year, she faced the prospect of losing everything she had built. It will still be standing when we return, Isaac said, as if reading her thoughts. I built those reinforcements to last. Catherine managed a weak smile. I hope you're right. The journey to town was tense, the smell of smoke growing stronger with each mile. Twice they had to detour around fallen trees, adding precious minutes to their travel time. By the time they reached Pine Creek, the southern sky was an apocalyptic orange, and ash drifted through the air like malevolent snow. The town was in organized chaos. Men formed bucket brigades while women and children loaded wagons with supplies. Mr. Peterson stood in the center of it all, shouting directions and assigning tasks. Daniels, he bellowed when he spotted them. Thank God, we need your expertise on where to establish the fire breaks. Isaac helped Catherine down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. Find Martha Jenkins, he said urgently. Stay with the other women and children. I'll come for you when it's over." Before she could respond, he was gone, striding toward Peterson and the group of men studying a hastily drawn map of the area. Katherine stood for a moment, disoriented and afraid, until a familiar voice called her name. "Katherine, over here." Martha Jenkins waved from the steps of the church, where several women were organizing bedding and supplies. For the next 12 hours, Katherine worked alongside the women of Pine Creek, preparing food for the firefighters, tending to minor injuries, and comforting terrified children. All the while, her thoughts remained with Isaac, out there somewhere in the smoke and flames. As dawn broke, the men began returning to town in small groups, exhausted and soot-covered but victorious. The fire had been contained before it could reach Pine Creek proper, though several outlying homesteads had been lost. Katherine scanned each group of returning men, her heart sinking when Isaac wasn't among them. By mid-morning, most of the firefighters had returned, but there was still no sign of him. He went with the group checking the eastern perimeter, Mr. Peterson told her when she finally worked up the courage to ask. Should have been back by now. Fear clutched at Katherine's throat. "My cabin is to the east," Peterson's expression was grave. "I know, Mrs. Taylor, we're organizing a search party now." Katherine didn't wait for the search party to assemble. She saddled Penny, ignoring Martha's protests, and rode out of town toward her homestead. The landscape was transformed. Blackened trees stood like skeletal sentinels against the sky, and the air was thick with ash and smoke. As she crested the hill that overlooked her property, Katherine's breath caught. Her cabin still stood, miraculously untouched by the fire that had ravaged the forest around it. The firebreak Isaac had insisted on clearing around the perimeter of her property had held, but there was no sign of Isaac or his horse. Katherine urged Penny forward, calling Isaac's name. The silence that answered her was deafening. She circled the cabin, checked the small stable, and was about to ride back toward town when she spotted something moving at the edge of the creek. Isaac's buckskin was drinking from the water, still saddled but riderless. Cold fear washed over Katherine as she dismounted and approached the horse. "Where is he, boy?" she whispered, stroking the animal's neck. "Where's Isaac?" The buckskin nickered softly, nudging her with his nose before turning to look downstream. Katherine followed his gaze and saw a dark shape on the bank of the creek, half in and half out of the water. "Isaac," she cried, running toward him, her heart in her throat. He lay face down, one arm submerged in the creek. For one terrible moment, Katherine thought he was dead. Then he groaned, shifting slightly. "Isaac," she gasped, kneeling beside him and gently turning him onto his back. His face was covered in soot, and a nasty gash ran along his hairline, but his eyes flickered open at her touch. "Katherine," he mumbled, disoriented. "The cabin, it's standing," she assured him, tears of relief streaming down her face. "You saved it. You saved everything." Isaac tried to sit up, wincing with pain. "Fell from my horse. Something spooked him near the burned section. Think I hit my head on a rock." Katherine helped him into a sitting position, noting with concern how he favored his left side. "We need to get you to a doctor." Isaac shook his head, immediately regretting the movement. "Just need to rest a bit, make sure nothing's broken." Katherine ignored his protests, using all her strength to help him to his feet. Together, they made their way slowly back to the cabin, Isaac leaning heavily on her smaller frame. Inside, she eased him onto the bed, ignoring his murmured objections about dirtying her quilt. Working quickly, she heated water and gathered what medical supplies she had. The gash on his head would need stitching, but first she needed to clean away the soot and assess his other injuries. "You shouldn't have come looking for me alone," Isaac said as she gently wiped his face clean. "It was dangerous." Katherine met his gaze steadily. "Would you have done any differently if our positions were reversed?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "No." "Then don't ask me to be less than you would be," she said simply, continuing her ministrations. As she worked, Katherine became acutely aware of their situation alone in her cabin, Isaac lying on her bed, her hands moving over his body with increasing familiarity as she checked for injuries. It was intimate in a way that transcended physical closeness, born of mutual trust and growing affection. Isaac seemed aware of it too, his eyes following her movements with an intensity that had nothing to do with pain. When she finished cleaning the wound on his head, he caught her wrist gently. "Katherine," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "before we were interrupted yesterday, I was about to say something important." Her heart stuttered. "Isaac, you're injured, you should rest." "I've waited long enough," he said firmly. "Facing death has a way of clarifying what matters." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Katherine Taylor. I think I've loved you since I saw you hammering shingles on that roof, too stubborn to ask for help but too determined to give up." Katherine's hands trembled. "Isaac, you don't need to say anything now," he continued. "I know it's soon. I know you're still grieving Thomas, but I want you to know where I stand. I'm not passing through Pine Creek. I'm not drifting anymore. I've found where I want to put down roots, and it's here with you if you'll have me." Tears filled Katherine's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered. "When I couldn't find you, I realized." She stopped, the words catching in her throat. Isaac reached up, brushing away her tears with his thumb. "Realized what?" "That I love you too," she said, the admission both terrifying and freeing. "That somehow, when I wasn't looking, you became essential to me, not just for the work you've done on the cabin, but for the way you've helped rebuild me." Isaac pulled her down until their foreheads touched, mindful of his wound. "I was broken too," he murmured. "We've healed each other." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question and an answer all at once. When they parted, Katherine saw in Isaac's eyes the same wonder she felt, the same disbelief that something so precious could emerge from so much loss. "We should get back to town," she said reluctantly. "Let everyone know you're alive." Isaac nodded, though he made no move to rise. "Soon," he promised. "But first, will you sit with me a while longer? I've spent too many years alone, Katherine. I don't want to waste another minute." She settled beside him on the edge of the bed, her hand entwined with his. Outside, the forest smoldered, but the cabin stood strong around them, a testament to what could be built from ashes. News of their engagement spread through Pine Creek faster than the wildfire had. There were those who whispered it was too soon, that Katherine hadn't properly mourned her husband. But for every whisper of disapproval, there were two voices of support, people who had seen the transformation in both Katherine and Isaac, who recognized that some loves don't follow conventional timelines. Mr. Peterson offered Isaac a permanent position as chief engineer for the expanding mill operations, along with a substantial increase in salary. To everyone's surprise, Isaac hesitated before accepting. "I want to be sure it's what you want," he told Katherine as they sat on the porch of her cabin, their cabin now, in all but legal formality. "Taking the position means staying in Pine Creek for the foreseeable future." Katherine looked out over the homestead, the garden now flourishing, the corral housing not only Penny but two young colts Isaac had purchased at auction. "This is our home," she said simply. "I couldn't imagine being anywhere else." Isaac's smile was radiant, nor could I. They were married in October, when the aspen trees turned gold against the blue Colorado sky. The ceremony was small, held on the porch of the cabin that had come to symbolize their journey together. Martha Jenkins had insisted on organizing the celebration, and the entire town turned out to witness the union of the widow and the engineer. As Katherine stood beside Isaac, speaking vows that felt both familiar and entirely new, she thought of Thomas. There was no guilt now, only gratitude for the love they had shared, for the strength he had helped her discover in herself, and for the cabin he had built that had ultimately led her to Isaac. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Isaac kissed her with a tenderness that belied the passion she knew he was capable of. Their guests cheered, and for the first time since arriving in Colorado territory, Katherine felt truly at home. That night, after the guests had departed and they were alone in the cabin, Isaac presented Katherine with a gift, detailed plans for expanding the cabin, transforming it from a single room into a proper home. "I thought we might start building in the spring," he said, watching her face as she examined the drawings. "Add a proper bedroom, a larger kitchen, maybe a small room for," he hesitated, suddenly uncertain. Katherine looked up, her eyes shining with tears and something else, hope, love, anticipation. For children, she finished softly. Isaac nodded, his expression vulnerable. If that's something you want. Katherine set aside the plans and moved into his arms, pressing her body against his with newfound confidence. It's everything I want, Isaac. A home, a family, a future with you. As winter settled over Pine Creek, the expanded cabin took shape not just on paper but in their shared dreams. Isaac continued his work at the mill, designing innovations that would eventually be implemented in lumber operations throughout the territory. Katherine maintained her position as bookkeeper, her sharp mind and attention to detail earning her respect beyond Pine Creek's borders. In the evenings, they would sit before the fire, planning their future. Sometimes they spoke of children, imagining little ones with Isaac's blue eyes or Katherine's dark curls. Other times they discussed the homestead, the orchard they would plant, the additional livestock they would acquire. And sometimes they simply held each other in comfortable silence, marveling at the journey that had brought them together, a widow struggling to keep her cabin standing, and the cowboy who had brought wood, fire, and love instead. Spring arrived with promise, the forest around their cabin regenerating after the previous summer's fire. New growth pushed through blackened earth, a testament to nature's resilience. On the first truly warm day, Isaac and Katherine stood together on their land, surveying the foundation he had laid for the cabin's expansion. Her hand rested unconsciously on her abdomen, where the first signs of their child had begun to make themselves known. "It's going to be beautiful," Katherine said, leaning into Isaac's solid presence beside her. "It already is," he replied, his arm tightening around her waist. "Everything I could have dreamed of." As the sun dipped toward the mountains, casting long shadows across their homestead, Katherine thought of how far they had come. The cabin that had once represented her losses now stood as a symbol of everything she had gained: strength, love, family, future. Isaac caught her contemplative expression and pressed a kiss to her temple. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Daniels?" Katherine smiled, still not entirely used to her new name, though she treasured it. "I was thinking about how sometimes what seems like an ending is really just the beginning of something else, something even better than we could have imagined." Isaac nodded, his eyes reflecting the golden light of evening. "I spent years running from what I thought was failure, never realizing I was running toward you. And I was trying so hard to hold onto the past that I almost missed the future standing right in front of me," Katherine added. Together, they watched as the last light of day gilded their cabin, the structure that had brought them together, that had withstood fire and storm and grief. Like them, it had been tested, reinforced, and made stronger by the challenges it had faced. And like them, it stood ready to embrace whatever the future might bring, a testament to the enduring power of resilience, hope, and love.